If you're already familiar with my content, you may be thinking, hold on a second, this isn't a video game. And you're right, it's not. But even though this channel may be video game centric, I still might want to take the opportunity to talk about other things that I really like. And I really like Godzilla. Since this is the first time I'm talking about Godzilla on this channel, let me give a personal history on the topic and my own thoughts on the other Godzilla movies in the MonsterVerse. If you want to go straight to the review of Godzilla vs. Kong, use the chapter function to skip ahead, or check the description for a timestamp. Keep in mind though, this review is not completely spoiler-free. Anyway, I've always had a vague interest in tokusatsu media for pretty much my whole life. As a kid, I liked Power Rangers and knew who Ultraman was, and I'd catch glimpses of Showa-era Godzilla films on rare occasions too. I've seen the 1998 American film a couple of times, and while I do consider it an overall entertaining monster movie, it didn't really leave a lasting impression. However, things changed when the 2014 American Godzilla movie came out. I was really intrigued by the film starting from its announcement and during the lead up to its release, especially thanks to the incredible Comic-Con 2012 teaser trailer featuring the infamous J. Robert Oppenheimer atomic bomb speech. When the movie finally hit theaters, I was not disappointed. Unlike some, I actually really loved what director Gareth Edwards did with the Jaws-like less is more approach to the presence of Godzilla himself. Some were frustrated with the movie's penchant for cutting away when the titular monster was about to enter the scene, and I understand why. That's the opposite of what you'd normally want when a giant monster begins a rampage, but I found the teasing to work very efficiently on me. When Godzilla was finally revealed in all his gargantuan, nuclear-powered majesty when he stomps into that Hawaii airport, I was awestruck. That moment captured the scale, destructive power, and intimidating presence of the beast in a way that almost defied description. It all led up to a cathartic ending that still amazes me today. There's so many awesome moments in the last 30 minutes or so. There's the reveal of Godzilla's atomic breath, when the eerie blue light illuminates Brody's face and even distracts his character from near certain death. The bright blue slowly crawls up Godzilla's dorsal plates and finally erupts from his mouth with immense force. It's one of the few times I got genuine chills in the movie theater, the perfect example of fan service at its best. And then Godzilla later finishes off the female Muto by doing it again directly into its mouth, which severs the head entirely. God damn, what an immensely satisfying last act. And it was all so breathtakingly gorgeous. Gareth Edwards has such an eye for visuals. The Halo jump sequence was equal parts mesmerizing and haunting. It was incredible. When the credits finally rolled, I went back to the theater lobby and bought another ticket for the next showing in about an hour. It was the first time I had ever watched the same movie twice in one day at the theater. And this was back when I was going over there almost every weekend for 5 straight years. It was the best reintroduction of Godzilla to Western audiences I could have possibly asked for. The experience ignited something within me that I didn't even know was there, and inspired me to go back home and watch every single Godzilla movie in any way that I could. And I mean every single movie. In a lot of cases, I had to resort to piracy, but I watched them. I rewatched the 1954 original, I watched the entire Showa era and all its campiness, including its shameful lows like All Monsters Attack. I watched the generally more serious Heisei era and its towering highs like Godzilla vs. Biollante and vs. Destroya. And I watched the Millennium era with its fascinating new approaches like Giant Monsters All Out Attack. My newly found obsession with Godzilla even bled over to other franchises like Gamera and Daimajin. I spent a good couple months living and breathing all things kaiju before I finally settled down. Then it all came bubbling back up as we inched closer to the release of Shin Godzilla, and then again with greater force to the lead-up of 2014's direct sequel, Godzilla King of the Monsters. If Godzilla 2014 was a formal reintroduction, then King of the Monsters, directed by Mike Dougherty, took the opportunity of those formalities being over and sought to give the people what they truly wanted. Almost non-stop monster-on-monster carnage. By bringing in the chaotic Rodan, the lovable Mothra, and the big bad of the Toho monster universe, King Ghidorah, fans were finally able to see exactly what a no-holds-barred kaiju brawl looks like with a Hollywood-level budget and visual effects. And what a spectacle it was. King of the Monsters was a gleeful exercise in eye-popping, vibrant destruction. King Ghidorah was just as much of a badass as anyone would hope for. Rodan's sequence against the Jets in Mexico is the coolest he's ever looked, and Mothra was just beautiful every time she showed up. And Burning Godzilla, man, the way he literally melted his surroundings by just walking forward, god damn, that was rad. If the movie had any weaknesses to speak of, it was probably the flimsier script featuring the usual bland human characters, but now with even worse attempts at humor. And the questionable editing that occasionally cut away from the action, kind of like the 2014 movie did, which was rather bothersome this time around because King of the Monsters clearly wasn't trying to have the same Jaws-like approach to its beasts. It wanted to give us in-your-face kaiju fights, so when we're forced to turn away this time around, it was more frustrating. Sometimes cool moments were interrupted by cutting to the faces of slack-jawed humans for 2 seconds, only to cut back to the action anyway. A lot of shots could have benefited from lingering for just a few more seconds. However, it was still an overall immensely entertaining monster action movie. A lot of Godzilla fans preferred it because of its greater focus on action, but if I'm being totally honest with you, I still think 2014 is the overall better made movie. Unfortunately, the greater focus on the bestial cast didn't save King of the Monsters from making a markedly smaller amount of money in the box office. Grossing only about $386 million worldwide compared to the $529 million of the 2014 film, it was considered a disappointment. And it led some fans to worry about how it'll affect the already announced Godzilla vs. Kong crossover movie, pitting the massive atomic lizard against the mighty ape we met in 2017's Kong Skull Island, which was also a very entertaining movie with a much better human cast. Thankfully, the sequel pressed ahead with production, but predictably saw a delay from a November 2020 release to March 2021 due to the ongoing pandemic. But now it's here, the presumed final chapter of Legendary's MonsterVerse series, where two of the greatest titans in monster movie history finally clash in a modern-day, high-budget spectacle. It took a lot of work and a lot of patience to reach this point, but kaiju lovers can finally rejoice that the wait has paid off, and we finally get to feast our eyes on Godzilla vs. Kong. Does the movie line up to, or even surpass, the standard set by the previous titles in the franchise? Before we start, let me give a little warning. There's going to be spoilers in this review because there's a certain aspect of this movie that I can't not talk about. It's technically not a spoiler because it was spotted in the film's first teaser trailer, so you probably know what I'm talking about. Either way, this is a heads up, just in case you may want to truly go into the movie as blind as possible. Anyways, let's finally get this review started and talk about the movie. Godzilla vs. Kong is directed by Adam Wingard, most known for his 2011 slasher film You're Next and his 2014 thriller film The Guest, both of which I've seen and really enjoyed. However, his next two movies, Blair Witch and Death Note, weren't so hot, especially the latter, which drew a lot of criticism from fans of the anime and manga. I can't say that I enjoyed it much either. Regardless, I was still more than willing to give Adam a chance when he was announced as the director for this next and probably last entry in Legendary's MonsterVerse film franchise. It's definitely a project that is larger than anything else he had done, but now that I've seen it with my own eyes, I think he had a great vision. The film takes place 5 years after the events of King of the Monsters, and answers the question of where Kong was throughout that film's events. Turns out he was kept in a massive closed facility on Skull Island, watched over by Monarch for his own protection. He's developed an emotional bond with a young native girl named Gia, who is deaf and can communicate with him through sign language. In the outside world, however, the peace that was granted after the defeat of King Ghidorah doesn't last long, as Godzilla is somehow provoked into attacking a facility in Florida owned by a corporation named Apex Cybernetics. This sends many organizations into a panic as Godzilla had never attacked humans before, and Monarch is tasked with releasing Kong as the final defense against the angry atomic lizard. For the sake of getting it out of the way, let's discuss the human characters first. I know, they've always been the weakest part of every entry in the MonsterVerse thus far, save for a few specific characters. Some kaiju films manage to make investing and well-written humans, but they tend to be the exception as opposed to the rule. Typically, the best we can hope for are humans that are simply serviceable or adequate, as opposed to actively grating or distracting. But a human perspective is still needed in order to create a narrative that helps push the movie forward and explain why these behemoths are throwing down. The humans are there to help create the stakes. Much to my relief, I found the humans of Godzilla vs. Kong to be pretty fine. A couple particular individuals might be divisive, but for the most part I think almost everyone served their purpose fairly well. The biggest point of contention may be the Godzilla crew, Millie Bobby Brown as Madison, Brian Tyree Henry as Bernie, and Julian Dennison as Josh, who honestly feel like they serve the least amount of purpose. Their whole arc kind of meanders until they have to literally just pour liquid onto a computer. That's their biggest contribution to the story, really. The young Kaylee Hoddle who plays Gia is particularly noteworthy, as she practically carries the human aspect of the story on her back thanks to her close bond with Kong. There are a couple of human villains worth discussing, most notably Damian Bichir as Walter Simmons, the CEO of Apex. As a mustache-twirling billionaire, his motives are actually altruistic, at least on the surface, as he seeks to eliminate the Titans so that mankind itself can be the alpha species of the planet. But then again, who's to say he won't use this power for less savory reasons later? While he doesn't have much in the way of screen time, he manages to establish himself as a sort of Lex Luthor figure of the MonsterVerse. Then we have Walter's accomplice, Ren Serizawa, played by Shun Oguri. And yes, you heard that character's name correctly, Serizawa. He's the son of Ishiro Serizawa, played by Ken Watanabe in the previous two Godzilla movies. And sadly, his character is probably the most wasted opportunity of not just the human cast, but probably the entire movie. No one brings up the fact that he's Ishiro's son, nor does anyone seem to care, not even Ren himself. Honestly, he could have been given literally any other name and it wouldn't have changed his presence in the movie at all. And this highlights the persistent issue throughout the runtime that some actors in here are just very underutilized. Lance Reddick is in this movie and he has quite literally just one line and about 4 seconds of screen time. Even some main characters felt like they didn't get as much opportunity to really justify their existence at all. But that's kinda par for the course for these movies. Overall, the human cast is pretty serviceable, but whether they're an improvement over the human cast of the previous two films is really up to the individual. Personally, I would say I prefer the humans in Godzilla vs. Kong at least over King of the Monsters, because here we're spared from most mediocre attempts at humor or family drama. The movie gives a very basic bio on everyone and then just barrels forward, which I can honestly appreciate, because there's definitely an argument to be made that no attempts at character depth is preferable to failed attempts at character depth. As it stands, I'd say that among MonsterVerse titles, Kong Skull Island still sits at the top in regard to its human cast, especially thanks to John C. Reilly. Story-wise, Godzilla vs. Kong is honestly pretty damn out there. It has thrown away any semblance of groundedness that the MonsterVerse might have started with in Godzilla 2014. And I know that calling a disaster/kaiju movie grounded is pretty questionable to begin with, but considering its darker direction, it was at least closer in tone to the original 1954 movie. That level of seriousness is pretty much nowhere to be found in Godzilla vs. Kong, which isn't a bad thing. After King of the Monsters, it only makes sense to maintain or even escalate the craziness of the Titan-infested world, and this movie does exactly that. It shamelessly calls back to the ridiculousness of the mid to late Showa era films by Toho. The most absurd concept in this film is Hollow Earth, the in-universe theory that our planet actually has a hollow layer several miles under the surface, teeming with more strange life. Kong's side of the movie has him travel down there to discover remnants of his ancestors, and while it's very enthralling both conceptually and visually, the story doesn't seem to take full advantage of the idea, and we're only down there for what feels to be about 15 minutes or so. But it does open the door for cool stuff should the MonsterVerse continue. On the Godzilla side of the narrative, there's actually not much going on with the big lizard himself, but the characters who are driven to action by his odd behavior is what ties Apex into the plot, giving some insight as to what they're doing, including the fact that they're the ones who have come into possession of Ghidorah's severed head, seen in the post-credit scene of King of the Monsters, which is utilized in a manner that makes more sense near the end of the film. But of course, the human characters and the plot are only just part of the experience. The real main event of a kaiju movie is the monster-on-monster brawling, so how about we finally talk about it? To put it in few words, it's absolutely astounding. I had an immense amount of fun watching this movie. If I'm being completely honest, I actually feel that Godzilla vs. Kong did a better job of delivering King of the Monsters' promise of Titan action than King of the Monsters did. That's not to say that I dislike that movie. I enjoy it a lot, especially with how badass it makes Ghidorah, Rodan, and Mothra look. But Godzilla vs. Kong just feels so much more focused on what it's trying to offer. I mentioned near the beginning of the video that I felt like one of King of the Monsters' biggest weakness was its habit of cutting away from cool moments too early just to show humans doing nothing important for a couple seconds before cutting back. I found that to be the most frustrating aspect of that movie, but thankfully that never occurs here. When the kaiju action begins, the movie stays on it and gives as coherent of a delivery of these fights as possible. It was more focused and had better editing, pacing, and visibility. The visuals are incredible. The movie almost feels like a tech demo of smoke, water, and particle effects. The battles are destructive and awesome, and there were never any useless arbitrary cuts that made keeping up with them a chore. The locations of these fights are also extremely good. The first confrontation between Kong and Godzilla is on a boat in the middle of the ocean, accompanied by a fleet of battleships. And it creates a very interesting dynamic that features Kong trying to navigate how to survive this tussle when he's not capable of surviving in the water like his opponent. While in the Hollow Earth, Kong also has some run-ins with local beasts and finishes off one of them in a particularly gnarly manner. Near the end of the movie, there's also a throwdown in nighttime Hong Kong, which is fantastically decorated with vibrant neon lights in every shot. It reminded me of Pacific Rim, the good one, not Uprising. And even though we know Godzilla isn't a villain per se, the movie still manages to do a pretty good job of painting him as one for most of the runtime. Because despite the audience knowing that he's being provoked, he's still ultimately a force of nature capable of unprecedented devastation. Eventually, the fight leads into daytime, where a third participant joins in. Now, this is your last warning to turn away if you don't want any spoilers whatsoever, because now I'm going to bring up the worst-kept secret, if it was meant to be one at all, about this movie. Mechagodzilla. And man oh man does shit get crazy when he shows up. Back when the MonsterVerse was announced to even be a thing, I never thought Legendary would have the balls to actually bring in Mechagodzilla and play it straight. But they did, and it's incredible. Its design is a little odd to look at first, but once the action started, I grew to really like it. It's a distinct combination of modern-day tech, but with a touch of Showa-era campiness. It sort of comes off like a functioning prototype that wasn't yet given the elegance of a final design. Each of the three big beasts, mechanical or otherwise, bring in a lot of personality in the way that they fight. Godzilla is all about sheer force and brutality, constant use of his mouth, claws, and tail to overpower his opponent. Kong is much faster and more agile, using his speed to get out of the way of particularly dangerous attacks, like the atomic breath. And then Mechagodzilla uses all of its machinery to try and get the upper hand, including boosters, lasers, blades, and missiles. For a giant machine, it's outstandingly quick on its feet, and uses that speed to be as violent and merciless as possible. Throughout the different fights in the movie, there's also throwbacks and references to other popular moments in past Godzilla movies, including the iconic scene of Kong shoving a tree into Godzilla's mouth and Mechagodzilla attempting its own kiss of death on Godzilla. If there's any complaint that I have about the gorgeous mayhem, it's that the final fight involving Mechagodzilla is honestly a little bit short. It could have definitely benefited from just a few extra minutes. Don't get me wrong though, Mecha G still managed to leave one hell of an impression in the little screen time it has when it's up and moving around on its own. I do feel especially sorry for Hong Kong in this movie because holy shit does it get absolutely leveled in all the chaos. You could drop an atom bomb in the middle of the city and it probably would have done less damage than the three monsters caused. Lastly, there's music, which is composed by Tom Holkenborg, also known as Junkie XL. This aspect of the movie is kinda split for me. The score does manage to hit adequate peaks of loudness and power when appropriate, but something about it fails to strike a chord with me like the scores of 2014 and King of the Monsters did. I feel like Alexander Desplat and Bear McCreary gave us music that helped elevate the experience, whereas Holkenborg merely delivers a sound that's expected of a typical Hollywood blockbuster, but without any type of throwbacks to original themes from Akira Ifukube or other Toho composers, which is pretty disappointing. I guess some people might consider those homages and leitmotifs played out, but themes have always contributed to the presence of every major monster in Toho's lineup. It's part of their identities, so it's a shame to not hear any creative new renditions of them. That being said, this film's score isn't completely devoid of its own moments. Overall, I really enjoyed Godzilla vs. Kong. It's a very fun experience carried by fantastic fights featuring its three main monsters. It's an awe-striking ride of total destruction, paced and edited very well. It could be marred a bit by weak human characters, which is honestly to be expected, and also by some supremely crazy, in-universe logic that calls back to the days of nutty, campy, mid to late Showa era films. It could enhance the fun for some, but it could also be distracting with its ridiculousness, like downloading the energy signature of a radioactive rock never seen before and somehow recreating it almost instantly in a different location. But then again, this is a movie starring a giant radioactive lizard, a giant axe-wielding gorilla, and a giant robotic copy of said lizard controlled by the consciousness of a dead alien. Personally, I quite like the insanity of it. With the review finally out of the way, I think there's something to be said about the extra subjective nature of what makes a good Godzilla experience. Our favorite radioactive lizard has a lot of movies that vary wildly in tone, scope, and quality. And this incredible spectrum can impact what we want the most out of these films. Typically, if you grabbed any random 10 Godzilla fans, chances are pretty good that their top 5 Godzilla movies will be pretty different. If any of them have a chance of sharing one movie, it's likely the original 1954 film, and even then it might not take the number 1 spot for any of them. At the end of the day, a person's expectations of a Godzilla title could be totally different from everyone else's. Sure, it's easy to say that we all want monster action, and that is true for the most part, but a lot of fans have differing criteria of what makes adequate monster action, and sometimes it changes from movie to movie. Personally, I liked Godzilla vs. Kong for its great action, but at the same time, I also think King of the Monsters is the overall weakest movie in the MonsterVerse. I'm probably an outlier for feeling that way, but my expectations for a Godzilla flick are typically controlled by what I feel is the goal of that particular movie. And sometimes I feel that goal is fulfilled, and sometimes it isn't. I don't know, I'm probably not making any sense, but it's what I truly think. All that's left now is to wonder about the future of the MonsterVerse. The only thing in production right now is an animated series focusing on Skull Island, and it's heavily assumed that Godzilla vs. Kong could be the last movie we'll get. Perhaps the door for more movies is still open if this one is enough of a success and Toho still feels like playing ball. Ultimately, it seems like the MonsterVerse always built up to this movie specifically, and I think Legendary is prepared to let our scaly friend go if they need to. But I would be lying if I said I wasn't interested in more. I would love to see a MonsterVerse iteration of Biollante or Destroya, or hell, even Jet Jaguar or King Caesar. If we want that, we'll have to make our voices heard, preferably by ensuring that Godzilla vs. Kong succeeds, and I really hope it does. This concludes my review of Godzilla vs. Kong. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.